Sunday on C-SPAN beginning at 8 and 11 p.m. Eastern Time.
Up next, our election night coverage continues with the debate among the candidates vying for the governor's seat in New York. From Syracuse, incumbent Democrat Mario Cuomo faces off against Republican challenger Pierre Renfret. Also joining the debate are Louis Wine, New York Right to Life candidate, and Herbert Landon.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first debate among four of the candidates for governor of New York State. Joining us tonight are the two-term incumbent, Governor Mario Cuomo, the Democratic and Liberal Party candidate, economist Pierre Renfret, the Republican Party candidate, New York University Dean Herbert Landon on the ballot as the Conservative candidate, and Louis Wine, candidate of the Right to Life Party. Now, here are the rules for our broadcast. Questions will be directed to a specific candidate. That candidate will then have 2 minutes and 30 seconds to answer the question. The other candidates will then have 1 minute each for rebuttal or comment. There will be no opening or closing statements. Asking the questions will be a panel of Syracuse journalists. They are Gus Bliven of the Syracuse Post-Standard, Dean of Legislative Correspondence in Albany. Seated next to Gus, Scott Atkinson, a reporter for WTVH-TV. And the third member of our panel, Eric Criss, Capitol correspondent for the Syracuse Herald-Journal. Now, the order of appearance is based on the order in which the candidates' names will appear on the ballot in next month's election. The first question is for Governor Cuomo, and Gus Bliven will begin the questioning. Gus?
Governor, despite a $1.8 billion state tax and fee hike this year, you are now saying there is a substantial state budget deficit. Ned Reagan says that it's about $246 million now and will go to between $2 and $3 billion next year. What do you plan to say and do about it, and when, before or after election?
I think there is no question that there is now a lag in our revenues. We are at the 6-point period in the year-long budget period, and we're, as the controller indicates, perhaps $246 million behind. He indicated after the first quarter that we were $30 million ahead, and so this is a matter of some uncertainty and fluidity. I project that we will have a deficit in the current year, conceivably larger than $246 million, and have already announced that we will not end this year with a deficit as we did last year. We will this year instead call back the legislature and do what we have to do to balance this budget without taxes and without borrowing. What that will mean is cutting. The first place to start cutting is with the $295 million or so that was added by the legislature to this year's budget after we completed negotiations and after I suggested there be no further spending. So we'll look first at the $295 million. There's a whole series of other things that need to be done. A freeze, perhaps the disposition of some assets. Personnel is a very large part of the budget, and to the extent to which you can control personnel costs, you can deal with much of the problem. But no taxes, no borrowing, balance the budget by the end of the year. After this budget, I suspect that next year is going to be a very difficult one to balance as well. And once again, and here the majority leader of the Senate, Senator Marino, who happens to be a Republican, the Speaker Mel Miller of the Assembly, agree with me. Next year, we're going to have to be very, very tough on expenditures because there will be a projected deficit. We want to avoid tax increases next year because we have won a large advantage over our neighbors by bringing our taxes down state level to 19th in the United States, by reducing the income tax to the lowest level in 30 years. It is now half of what the Republicans left us in 1975, by not raising the sales tax, which has been 4% for all the years that I've been governor, by not raising the gas tax since 1972, while states around us are raising their income, raising their sales tax. So we have gained an advantage. Our local taxes, like in New York City and Nassau County, are still too high, but those, regrettably, I cannot control.
Thank you, Governor. And now, with 1 minute for comment or rebuttal, Mr. Pierre Renfray.
It fascinates me that Governor Cuomo, Mario, discovered what I knew 110 days ago on the 1st of June, and I said this state was in deficit, $500 million to $1 billion this year, $2.5 to $5 billion next year. He heard me say it. He did nothing about it. And to say that we have the lower taxes, we pay the highest taxes in dollars of any state in the entire union. And I got a simple question to ask. If he is such a great manager, why is it that he found out 110 days after I knew that there was going to be a deficit this year and that we were in fiscal trouble, and I have publicly said that this state is going bankrupt the way the trend is going? And I just asked that question. How come I, as a private citizen, was able to figure out this budget 110 days ago, and the governor of the state of New York just discovered the problem? Simple. The answer is he can't manage the state.
Thank you, Mr. Renfray. And now we move on next to Mr. Herbert London. And you too, Mr. London, have 1 minute.
Thank you. George Orwell once said the first duty of intelligent people is the restatement of the obvious. Mr. Renfray wouldn't know the obvious if it hit him in the face, and Mr. Cuomo quite obviously cannot state the obvious. This state is facing very serious financial problems, not this year, but over the last 8 years. Why are we now talking about cutting the budget? We should have been talking about it the last 8 years. The personal income tax in New York is the highest in the United States. The combined state and local taxes, considering the mandated reforms pushed down to the local level, are now $164 of every $1,000 that are earned. $164. Think about that. Who is responsible for this deficit? After all, someone has to be accountable. It can't all be put at the doorstep of Mr. Marino and Mr. Miller. Clearly, the governor has some responsibility. It's also very clear that the governor has come to the conclusion that we have to cut expenses. Well, surely we should have been talking about cutting expenses long before now.
Thank you, Mr. London. And now for 1 minute, we turn to Mr. Ween.
It never ceases to amaze me that every election, you have the incumbent and the challengers fighting each other, saying, elect me, and I will save the state, I will save the city, I will save the county. And after 26 years of observation, it seems to me that whoever gets elected always faces the same problem. What I think is needed is not attacking Governor Cuomo or this guy or Renfray. What's needed is a total restructuring of our government that empowers the people of the state, empowers them with recall, with initiative, with referendum. Let's have legislators be responsible to their mandate. Let's have a full-time legislature. Let's stop the nonsense between the politicians. Let's have a new election law, an election law that empowers people, that get good candidates up there. I think all the shelling and screaming is not going to achieve anything. It's difficult times at the state level, at the national level. People have to get involved in the process, and that way we'll get something done.
Thank you, Mr. Ween. Now we move on to our second round of questions, and we turn to Scott Atkinson of WTVH-TV. Scott has a question for Mr. Renfray.
Mr. Renfray, on the subject of state spending, one of the real growth items in the state budget during the 1980s has been state aid for education, much of it at the behest of the Republican-controlled state Senate. If you're elected governor, what are you going to do about that?
Well, I think it's fairly obvious in answer to your question that so-called state aid to education, which has been growing somewhere between 10 and 12% a year for the last 8 years, has accomplished nothing at all in terms of the test scores or the literacy rates. The test scores have been coming down. The literacy rates are coming down. It is obvious that is not the solution. But I go back to a very simple point and a very simple concept, and I listened to Mr. Ween, and I'd like to make a couple of different observations which have to do with the legislative process. For example, I don't think anybody should be allowed to be in office much longer than 6 years. I think the Assembly limit should be 6 years. I think the Senate limit should be 6 years. And I think above all else, the governor limit should be 6 years. And I think right at this stage, it wouldn't be a bad idea for Mario to resign before he gets thrown out in an election. Because The reason, the problem that we've got in this government and the failure to act, and I agree that the behavior of this Cuomo administration, 9% compound rate of growth since 1983, 88% in his entire term, taxes go, for every dollar of tax cuts, and there have been tax cuts, $1.37 of tax increases. You can't talk just the income tax. You got to talk user fees. You got to talk all kinds of real estate taxes. And the problem we've got is a government which has gotten into the private sector, is pushing the private sector out of this state, and the people have lost all their incentives. The people are leaving this state. We had 150 major corporations approximately 8 years ago. We're down to 50 now. We have an anti-free enterprise administration, and one of the reasons is because we have politicians in office 10, 15, 20 years. The governor has never run a private business that I know of. He doesn't know how to run one. I've been running one for 36 years, and that's why we always do better than any government.
Thank you, Mr. Renfrey. And now, for 1 minute, we turn to Mr. London.
Was that question about education? Certainly the reply wasn't. Seems to me that there are some educational questions that have to be addressed here. Let me raise a question that Mr. Ween raises in his comment. He appears to be a cheerleader for Mr. Cuomo. I think there is blame that can rest at the doorstep of Mr. Cuomo, not only on the matter of spending, but certainly on the matter of education as well. During the 8 years under Mr. Cuomo, we have had more than 100% increase in educational expenditures in this state. We have very little that we've gotten for that 100% increase. As SAT scores have gone down in the United States, they've gone down more significantly in New York State. The answer to our educational woes, I believe, is parental choice. Provide parents with the opportunity to choose among private, parochial, and public schools, and see whether parents can make the right decision. I've never met a parent, black or white, rich or poor, Hispanic or non-Hispanic, who is saying, I want an inferior education for my child. If we give parents the opportunity to make that decision and take a portion of our state funds for parents, I think we'll have a very salutary effect on education in New York State.
Thank you, Mr. London. And now, for 1 minute, we turn to Mr. Lewis Ween.
Let's go to the solutions instead of the garbage. Let's restructure the State Board of Regents. Let's make them either appointed by the governor or elected on a regional basis. Today, they're unaccountable to anyone. Let's look at the idea that parents and family are very important in the educational process. And what we're doing is we're shifting responsibility away from the home into the school. We're requiring teachers to have all these degrees, all these certificates, but they're not doing the one thing that has to be done. They have to be teaching and instilling values. They have to be motivating. I don't think those degrees do that for them. I think we've gotten away from that basic. We have to bring discipline back into the classroom. I think that way we teach a child something, teach him something importantly about moral values, and then have that reinforced in the home and vice versa. I think we should scrap the Regents test in the state. It's a costly test. It's really meaningless. Let's set standards at the Regents level. Let's everybody live up to those standards. And let's ask our teachers to become, again, teachers as a vocation and not a profession.
Thank you, Mr. Ween. All right, Governor Cuomo, now it's your turn for 60 seconds.
Let me try to correct some misapprehensions, or what could be misapprehensions. We are not the highest income tax state in the United States of America, although my opponents have said that over and over. We are 12th. The number 164,000 per 10,000 or whatever it is pure fiction. There is nothing like that kind of mandate on local governments in this state. Over the last 8 years, we have increased aid to the local governments from 60% of our budget to 68% of our budget. As far as business growth is concerned, we lead the United States of America in the formation of new corporations. Our growth in personal income is above the United States of America's average, and our business growth was 30% over my tenure. As far as cutting expenses, I tried very hard. The Republicans and the Conservatives spent $1 billion more than I asked them to and raised $200 million in taxes. On choice, I agree. On the Regents, I agree.
Thank you, Governor Cuomo. Before we move on to our next question, there was a query regarding whether or not questions are sometimes evaded, or the answers to those questions are evaded. Let me tell our panelists that they have expressed some concern, the reporters who have worked on these questions. I'm sure that if there is any evasion, it is purely unintentional. but you know that the reporters have labored over these questions, and their feelings are easily hurt. Thank you, gentlemen. Now let us move on to Eric Chris from the Syracuse Herald-Journal. Eric has a question for Mr. London.
Mr. London, again tonight, as through the campaign, you have spoken about lowering taxes and cutting spending. You've also already called for more prisons in this state. Given your lack of experience as an executive in finding waste and inefficiency, specifically what government services would you cut as governor?
Thank you. Let me point out right at the outset that the Public Policy Institute of New York State has pointed out that the combined state and local taxes are $164 for every $1,000 that are earned by people in this state. And I'd suggest that the governor look at this document before he makes the claims that he does. Now let me talk about the cuts that are possible in New York. Number one, I think that we could lower Medicaid to the second highest level in the United States and save $400 million in the process. I think that it is possible to introduce a means test for the state university. At the moment, whether you earn $20,000 or you earn $500,000, you pay the same $1,450 in tuition. That is neither fair nor acceptable. Seems to me that what we should have is a means test which says to people under $20,000, you don't pay anything at all. Between $20,000 and $150,000, you will pay on a sliding scale, and over $150,000, you will pay the full freight, which is really $15,000 a year, for that's what it costs someone to attend the public institutions of New York State. Number three, I think that we can certainly eliminate the 3,500 automobiles owned and maintained by the state. I think that it is possible to eliminate the $122 million that we spend on members' items. I think that we can eliminate $775,000 by eliminating the 21 servants who presently work for the governor. I think that it is possible to eliminate a very significant portion of money by taking the New York State Council for the Arts and localizing the investment in the arts, saying to localities, if you want to provide for the arts, take care of your chamber music group or your arts council locally rather than have a state council. I think that it is possible to cut spending very significantly if we were to eliminate the state-owned ski resorts. Get those ski resorts on the tax rolls. Why should the taxpayers of this state be in the position of supporting ski resorts? I think that it is possible to introduce the privatization of many of our airports, including the Albany County Airport, which would add significant revenues to New York State and get that airport on the tax rolls. I think there are very significant cuts that can be made in our budget if we look at the bloated employee rate that we have in New York State. 634 per 10,000 in the population. The third highest in the United States. Only Alaska and Wyoming have more state employees than New York. Well, I think there are a lot of things that can be done where there is will, where there is resourcefulness, and where there is a desire to relieve the enormous tax burden that exists for the working people of New York.
Thank you, Mr. London. And now let's move on to a one-minute response from Mr. Ween.
Outside of Mario Cuomo, I'm the only one here with government experience that actually did work in the arena of limiting budgets. When I was the assistant to the mayor of New York City, I came up with a report that got me fired because I showed how we could reduce $300 million in bloated bureaucracy in the city of New York. When I worked in the White House in the reorganization of the Office of Economic Opportunity Programs, I was able to reduce significantly the wasted tax dollars. I think, though, we have to be realistic that no one here can say they're going to reduce taxes. I'm impressed by the New York Times advertisement that shows about 14 presidents showing, I will reduce taxes, elect me, taxes will go down. So you have to bring back these structural changes that I spoke to about before, and we have to balance the institutions of society to work together so that way we can have a meaningful reduction of the cost of government.
Thank you, Mr. Ween. All right, Governor, your turn at bat for 1 minute.
You know, it's easier to answer these questions if you just make up facts. And there's been an extraordinary number of misstatements. Let me rattle off some. The Albany County Airport, Mr. London, does not belong to the state of New York. You can't privatize it. It will mean nothing to the state of New York. The ski resorts, Mr. London, are required by the Constitution to be operated by the state. Just look at, I believe it is Article 14 of the Constitution that says Whiteface, Gore, Bel Air must be operated by the state, and incidentally, for the most part, they are privatized. The autos we cut by 25%. To privatize SUNY, I'm opposed to the idea of taking our public school system, maybe our grandest legacy in this wonderful democracy, and privatizing it so that a lot of wealthy people will go to SUNY instead of to the private school. Why not do it to high schools? You can make a lot of money that way by a means test. The 634 number is off by 456. I don't know who is writing your material. You couldn't be wrong about employees. We're 27th in the United States of America. Look it up.
Thank you, Governor Cuomo. And now we turn to Mr. Pierre Renfray.
I'm going to tell you, if Mario ever came in an economics class of mine and I taught advanced economics for 7 years, I'd give him a double F and throw him out of the class, because his numbers are the phoniest numbers I've ever seen. We pay $750 per year per capita in taxes. The average for the United States is $340. We are #1. Anybody, including the Bureau of the Census, will tell you that. So he talks of ratio of personal income. Well, Mario, I got news for you. You don't pay ratio of personal income. You pay real American dollars, and we are #1 in the nation. We have one of the highest sales taxes in the nation. We have one of the highest sales taxes in the nation, 8.25% of what I pay in the city of New York. That's not high? Boy, I don't want to know when you really get going in your third term, which you think you're going to get, you'll raise it to 20%. And not very long ago, you said you would approve 1 more % increase in the sales tax and 1 more % increase in the income tax. I think it's disgusting.
Thank you, Mr. Renfray. And gentlemen, you can rest easy now for a couple of minutes as we take a brief time out. We'll continue with more of our gubernatorial debate after these messages. We are back now with more of our debate in the race for governor, and once again we're going to hear from Gus Bliven of the Syracuse Post-Standard with a question for Mr. Lewis Ween.
Louis, you have said that if you can't be elected governor, you would prefer to have Governor Cuomo elected because you prefer him over all the other candidates. Will you expand on that? Why?
Oh, absolutely. If I could not be governor, I think I'd be one of the great governors of New York. When I look at the other opponents, I see serious weaknesses. I see in Mario Cuomo, and Mario, you and I ran against each other for mayor in 1977. We disagree substantially on the right to life issue, at least in our public positions. We disagree on capital punishment. But I know Mario Cuomo to be a man of decency and intelligence. I disagree with on some policies. He's out there working hard. I want to fight him. I'm running against him. I've run 21,000 miles in my car to try to get as many votes as I can. I looked at Mr. Pierre Renfray. I think Mr. Renfray is really not suited for public life. I think that has happened by the way he's articulated himself. Mr. London, who I've spoken about many times in a positive way. I've said Herb London is a man who's articulate and intelligent, but I think he lacks the experience in government, in business. I believe that he has no record or discernible record of public service, and I have problems with his leadership role as a fellow Republican. He didn't go to the state convention like I did. He didn't show his leadership on the right to life question. I think there are issues there that seem to be talking out of two sides of the mouth. And I favored, quite honestly, Mario Cuomo over the other challengers. And I'm the type of fellow, Gus, as you know, who says exactly what he means, says it directly, doesn't equivocate. I think I'm the only one who's answering the questions here, because I'm not getting into all this garbage of statistics, and that's why all these people out there are turned off. If we get 1% of the people of New York State to watch this debate, we're going to be lucky, because all they hear is the same thing over and over. You're no good. You've got the taxes. You can't do this. I called Mario Cuomo up when I first got the nomination, and he called me back as a gentleman. And I said, Mario, we have an opportunity to create a new era of politics. Let's stop the finger pointing. Let's stop the name calling. And let's address the issues in an intelligent manner. I can tell you that Mario Cuomo has kept his part of the bargain, and I have kept my part of the bargain. I am not a shill for him. I'm not looking for a job, as Mr. London said I am. That's ridiculous. But anyone with half a brain in this state knows, no matter how much they may disagree with Mario Cuomo on issues, he's by far the most competent candidate of the three challenges that I have, the other two challenges I have. And that's my stated position. I may be wrong. That's my position.
Thank you, Mr. Wayne. Well, Governor Cuomo, you now have 1 minute in which to thank Mr. Ween.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Lou. The last time we debated in 1977, you didn't say these nice things about me. I'm making progress, and I thank you for it, Lou. Some quick observations about it. First of all, if ever I come to your economics class, I shouldn't be flunked, I should be committed. Let's get it clear. There is no 8.25% New York State sales tax. There is a 4% sales tax. They've raised sales tax in Connecticut, Massachusetts, all around us in New Jersey. They've doubled it. Ours is 4%. The way the law works in this state, local governments can add sales taxes to that. Some add 4, some have added 4.25. I think one of the problems with Lou Ween, Mr. London, Mr. Renfray, and I think they're all intelligent people, one of the reasons they haven't had the opportunity to reach the public perhaps the way they deserve to is the refusal of this state to do campaign financing reform. I was there. I started with no money, no television. It's very hard to make your case. These are 3 extraordinary individuals who could make a contribution. You would know that better if we had public financing, campaign financing. They've lost a chance because the Republicans won't give it to us.
All right, you now, Mr. Renfray, have an opportunity.
I now have to ask for the question to be repeated because the way it's been non-answered by both gentlemen is absolutely beyond me. Mr. Ween, whom I personally like and respect and admire, is the funniest guy that I've ever met as a stand-up comic. If he thinks he can't win, if he knows how wonderful Mr. Cuomo is, why is he even on the ballot? He's wasting our time and everybody else's time. He's not a candidate. This man is the candidate. This man is the enemy. This is the man that's got to be beaten, because I happen to believe that his management of this state is a disaster. And I got a very simple question to ask. If this state is doing so magnificently, why is everybody walking? Why are we 48th credit rating in the United States? Why is he almost on the edge of bankruptcy? And if he's also such a great, fabulous politician, which Mr. Ween is going to vote for, then I suggest Mr. Ween get out of the race and stop claiming he's in the race, because he's not. He's a phony, fake runner. He's not running. He's stalking horse for Cuomo, and anybody knows that.
Thank you, Mr. Renfray. All right, Mr. London, your turn.
I think it's quite apparent that Mr. Ween has discredited himself by serving as a cheerleader in this debate. It is perfectly obvious to me that since he is running on the Right to Life line, he should be aware of the fact that $15 million has been spent by the Cuomo administration to create abortions in New York State. And yet he's running on the Right to Life line and running to support Mr. Cuomo. Obviously, there's an extraordinary contradiction there. Moreover, not only is there a contradiction on that issue, but Mr. Ween has discredited himself by saying the people of this state who have half a brain would recognize the fact that I don't have leadership ability. Well, I don't have leadership ability the way Woodrow Wilson didn't have leadership ability when he left Princeton University and became the governor of New Jersey. And I don't have leadership ability the way John Silber, the Massachusetts candidate for governor, has left Boston University to take on the role of governor of Massachusetts, or possibly be governor of Massachusetts. And I'd like to make one other point. As far as statistics are concerned that are regarded as garbage, the number of state and local employees per 10,000 in this state is 634. Check that figure, Governor Cuomo.
Thank you, Mr. London. And now we're going to hear from Scott Atkinson. And Scott, your question is for Governor Cuomo.
Governor, if memory serves, the contracts with 2 large state employee unions, the CSEA and the Public Employees Federation, expire next spring and summer. In light of the state's financial difficulties, how will you or your agents negotiate with the unions? What will you want from these people?
Well, obviously, we will want, number one, to be fair to the working people of this state, including those who work for the state of New York. Remember who these people are. These are state police. These are people who change bedpans for developmentally disabled elderly people and children. These are people doing work that the private sector will not do. That's why government exists. And these are people who are entitled to dignity. On the other hand, one of our biggest expenses are the personnel costs, and we need to control them. It seems to me unlikely that we will be able to give the kind of raise that we did the last time, which was somewhere around 5.5%. The big tension will be between the amount of salary the unions would like to get for themselves and their willingness to deal with a reduced workforce. How do they feel about layoffs? Would they prefer to have more in salary and lay people off, which might be socially and as a matter of efficiency, not a good thing to do. That was the discussion we had last time. That's what I discussed with him last year. Let me talk again with Mr. London about state employees. These are the facts. We have 156, not 654. I don't know where he has his numbers. Well, I'm not talking about local. I don't run the city of New York. I don't run Republican Westchester. I don't run Republican Nassau. That's an absurd figure. It's like adding the taxes of New York City and using that. I'm talking about state workforce. It has grown by about 15,000 in 8 years, and those are mostly prison and SUNY. Would you fire them? Would you fire the prison officers? It has grown at about 6% under me, slower than the federal government, slower than the average. We are 27th in the United States in terms of full-time employees. No wonder you use local numbers. Our state numbers are so good, you have to do something in order to put yourself into a position where you criticize us. So we are not overpopulated with workers, and they are good workers. But regrettably, the condition of this state is such they are not going to be able to receive a generous increase, it seems to me. How do you go about negotiating it? OER, the Office of Employee Relations, is the unit in state government assigned to negotiate. They are doing that even now. How will it resolve itself? Either they will make an arrangement or there will be impasse, a procedure, and if the impasse continues, it will be left to the legislature. It's going to be difficult. There are going to be a lot of unhappy people, but the realities intrude.
Thank you, Governor. Next, we hear from Mr. Renfrey, who has 1 minute for rebuttal.
Well, as typical of Cuomo, typical of Mario, he's evaded the issue, he's avoided the issue, and I'd like to make a suggestion to you as a lifetime financial consultant who's obviously done fairly well. Now, I know you don't have any money, which proves that you really don't know how to manage your own affairs, according to the way you talk, but I'd like to make you a suggestion. Why don't you freeze the budget right now, as I said needed to be done 110 days ago. 110 days ago, I predicted the deficit. 110 days ago, I said the troubles is, why don't you freeze the budget right now, and why don't you let attrition take place in the state labor force, which runs 10.8% a year? And you're dead wrong on your numbers, as you always are, because you pick phony numbers. The right number for the state is 147 employees per 10,000. Of any advanced industrial state, it is the highest in the nation. Oh, yes, it is. Now, I don't know where you get your numbers from, but you don't get them from anybody who knows anything about numbers.
Thank you, Mr. Renfrey. And now we turn to Mr. London. You too, sir, have 1 minute.
It is quite apparent to anyone who has looked at the New York State number of employees. We have 158 state employees, but compare us to a state like California, where there are 107. Also look at the unit cost of need for an AIDS patient, for someone on Medicaid, for someone who is homeless. Roughly 2.5 times higher in New York State than California. And one has to ask the obvious question. Why is it so much more expensive to take care of people in New York than the state of California? Is it due to the fact that there are so many state employees? The answer seems rather obvious. Anyone who has looked at the state budget is aware of the fact that it has indeed gone up by 6% a year, as Mr. Cuomo has indicated. Except the inflation rate hasn't been 6% a year. It's been on the order of 4.5 to 5% a year. We are growing at a rate far in excess of our inflation rate, and that is one of the reasons why this state is at the point of financial exigency. Were this a business, this would be in Chapter 11.
Thank you, Mr. London. And now for his 1 minute rebuttal, here's Louis Ween.
You see, the whole thing revolves around the idea that government is just too big because people, the voters, expect government to do all the work. And until we have this total restructuring of our government and a return to a balance and harmony with our families, with our communities, with our religious institutions, we are always going to have this problem. We have to return to that idea that people take care of people, not government. Government can do certain things very well, other things it can't do. I think that the minister, the priest, the rabbi, the imam can do more for people that government is now spending billions of dollars for, and more efficiently and more effectively if we joined in partnership with them. And we stop this idea that government in and of itself is going to be able to solve our problems. It cannot, it will not, and until we come to that belief, we will continue to have these spiraling costs.
Thank you, Mr. Wayne. Next question comes from Eric Chris of the Syracuse Herald-Journal. And Eric, your question goes to Mr. Renfrey.
Mr. Renfrey, your party and Mr. Cuomo's disagree on a bill to stiffen penalties against people who are motivated by prejudice when committing a crime. Mr. Cuomo says the Republicans don't like the bill because it would protect gay people along with other groups presumably targeted by these criminals. Do you believe that criminals should pay a higher price if they act with prejudice against gay people?
Well, I think it's a superb question, and I'll try and give you two very simple answers. I think that prejudice of any size, shape, or form should be put down by the society and eliminated by the society. And put it very simply, I support an anti-bias bill. I think that's the cancer in our society. It will ultimately destroy this society if we allow it to continue. And the only thing I personally care about is the ability of the person and the professionalism of the person. But I want to talk about one other thing. Mr. Ween kind of funny. And I know I'm not supposed to address anything to him, but Mr. Ween's kind of funny. After listening to him, he's just another stalking horse for Mr. Cuomo. That's why I love him. He called him the most viable candidate, and he's got to be really, that's the funniest joke I've ever heard in my life. He couldn't get 20,000 signatures for a petition. He says he's a Republican. The Republicans wouldn't endorse him. And this gentleman, who was fabulous at red herring across the trail of everything, and he's a magnificent, he's the greatest red herring puller I've ever met in my life, has totally walked away from the entire issue, namely, what are you going to do about a guy who says, I'm against government? He's the biggest government spender I've ever met. Mr. London is dead right on his numbers. But isn't it amazing that the governor yet, and you know why you cannot handle administration and why this administration is a disaster for 8 years? Because you don't know the right numbers and you don't get the right numbers. You ought to fire every economist you've got. You ought to fire the head of your budget. I'm going to ask you another question. How come I knew 110 days ago that this state was in bankruptcy? I knew that we were heading for a deep deficit this year and a worse deficit next year. You got a staff of a couple of hundred people and you just found out? I think that's wonderful. You're to be complimented. Your staff is incompetent, that's proven, or you don't want to hear it. This state is outspending every state. Explain to me the 48th credit rating we've got in the United States, the deterioration of the quality of our bonds, and the fact that one of the great municipal bond dealers calls this state's bonds the ultimate junk in the United States. Explain that to me and how you get solved that, and then have the audacity to stand here and tell me that you're managing this state.
Thank you, Mr. Renfrey. And now let's hear from Mr. Herbert London. He has 1 minute.
I'm glad to hear that I'm right from Pierre Renfrey. I thought the question was about the bias bill. Let me refer to the bias bill since that wasn't referred to. This is my opportunity to speak, is it not?
Right.
It seems to me that if we're going to look at the bias question, I am very much against the bias bill for the following reason. A heterosexual committing a crime against a homosexual represents one category of crime, but a homosexual committing a crime against a heterosexual represents a different category of crime. A white committing a crime against a black person represents one kind of crime, and a black committing a crime against a white person represents a different category of crime. It seems to me that we should simply say crime is crime. If there is prejudice involved and a crime is committed, I am absolutely opposed to any form of prejudice. But the point that has to be understood is we can't have categories of crime. A murder is a murder whether that person is black or white, Chinese or Indian. The point that we have to realize is that crime has to be eliminated in this state, and it has not been.
Thank you, Mr. London. Perhaps we should clear up the rules governing this debate so that everyone fully understands. Only when a question is directed to a candidate is he going to be restricted in his response in any way. Other than that, your 1 minute rebuttal or response time may take on any subject you choose. And now let's hear from Mr. Ween.
In 1977, when I was a candidate for mayor of New York City, I issued a very comprehensive war on drugs blueprint, which I reissued recently. And I called at that time for the idea to scrap this idea that it's more of a crime if you hit an old person than if you hit a young person, because at that time it was the Senior Citizens Bill they wanted to pass. Now it's the Homosexual Rights Bill. I think that you must really focus on the idea of crime as being criminal. That's why I call for flat time sentencing. If you punch somebody, if you harass someone, that's a crime. It should not be changed if you happen to hit someone old or someone who's gay. I believe that any type of harassment to anyone for race, color, creed, or for any reason is wrong. And if you want to create a class of crime for that, you should do that. But it's outrageous to think that we are going to start specifying that it's more of a crime if you do something against one segment of society, because our Constitution says equal protection of the laws. And there's a danger that that will not happen if you start segmenting society.
Thank you, Mr. Wayne. And now we're going to hear next from Governor Cuomo.
Thank you very much. Lou, just a point. I think all three of you are for the death penalty. With the death penalty, that's precisely what you do, is to say if you kill a certain person, then you get death. But you can kill another kind of person and not get death. And that was one of my difficulties with the Republicans on the bias-related violence bill. They were totally inconsistent. They made the argument you just made, and then they argued for the death penalty and contradicted themselves. I congratulate Mr. Renfrey. This is the right position, being for a bias-related violence bill. I also, out of this new affection and respect for my gentle opponent, I would like to correct him with bonds. Please don't talk casually about our bonds being junked. I don't know whose name you gave. I don't know. No, let me answer you if I may. The bonds sold at a premium after the Standard & Poor rating went down, as you know. The ratings went down, and you know this, because your party deliberately pushed us beyond the budget date, denied there was a problem, got out literature saying we were going down the tubes. Standard & Poor's reduced our rating before they saw the budget because your party made us late. That's what you wanted, was something to argue about at the expense of the state. I regret you got it.
Thank you, Governor. And now we'll hear from Gus Fliven. He has a question for Mr. London. Gus?
With the state in dire fiscal circumstances, would you support a casino gambling, an expanded lottery, all sorts, the whole 9 yards of legalized gambling?
I am absolutely opposed to legalized gambling for the following reason. I'm opposed because it is a transfer payment from the poor to the rich. Legalized gambling has not worked in the state of New Jersey and will not work in the state of New York. The question that really has to be addressed is how can we redress the fiscal problems that we have? It seems to me there are a number of steps that can be taken. I'm amused when the governor says that he is not responsible for the increase in expenditures. It's the Republicans in our state legislature. He submitted a bill to our Republican state Senate that asked for 10.9% increases in expenditures, which he called an austerity bill. That was roughly twice the rate of inflation, more than twice the rate of inflation. And it is also important to note, and has not yet been mentioned, that the governor of this state has an extraordinary power that President Bush only dreams about. It's called impoundment power and line item veto. In the last year of Governor Kerry's administration, and here I can make a bipartisan pitch, Governor Kerry used line item veto to remove $900 million from a budget of roughly $26 billion a year. In this fiscal year, Governor Cuomo removed $7 million from a budget of $50 billion a year. Now, it's quite obvious that the governor is not very serious about truly cutting expenditures and using the line item veto to engage in what are quite obviously needed cuts. Now, we have to address the problem of a budget that is out of control. That budget is not going to be improved by legalized gambling. If we are going to move in any direction at all, it seems to me we've got to look at significant expenditure cuts, cuts that should have been considered long before now. Gambling isn't the answer, but I can assure you there are very significant answers on the horizon. And these include looking at the questions that I've raised before about Medicaid, looking at the questions about so many of the superfluous expenditures that go on in New York State, looking at the number of employees who are presently employed by the state, looking at so many of those expenditures that come under line item veto. These are the issues that have to be considered, not whether, in fact, New York is going to move towards legalized gambling.
Thank you, Mr. London. The next response comes from Louis Ween.
Mario, I didn't understand your logic on the capital punishment. I believe that if someone takes the life of someone else, forcefully or brutally rapes another woman, a woman, or anyone, you have homosexual rape in prison, deals in traffic, kills people, kills law enforcement officers, that they forfeit their rights, certain rights, just like a drunk driver may forfeit the right to drive a car. And I don't understand how you equate bias with capital punishment. Because if you commit a heinous crime, Mario, I think society has a right to say, you may forfeit your life. And that's why in my call for capital punishment, I call for a two-tier trial system. Trial of the facts, and with a different jury, a trial of the sentence. And under no circumstances would anyone be convicted to death who was convicted on circumstantial evidence. We have to send a message clearly to the people of this state that you are going to be held responsible for your actions, and that society has a right to impose the death sentence for dastardly, egregious acts against society. And I just don't understand this bias. And I want to satisfy Mr. Renfrey and Mr. London when they think we don't have disagreements.
Thank you, Mr. Wayne. All right, Governor Cuomo, your turn.
Just quickly on that, Lou, the bill put by the Republicans say, the bills say, if you kill one kind of person, you get the death penalty, corrections officers, etc., but not others. They create a separate category. Now, there's an argument for the category, of course, but that is the contradiction. As to gambling, lottery, etc., I'm inclined to agree with Mr. London and have said that before. However, on the facts, once again, and this must sound terribly tedious, but this is mostly about numbers and statistics, and I think we ought to deal with it. I asked for $900 million in taxes, if you want to refer to the budget bill. Your Republicans gave us back $1.8 billion by your numbers. You look it up. I asked for $900 million. You did not deny that the Republicans over 8 years have spent $1.1 billion more than I asked for. You didn't deny that. You admit it. You say that I should have corrected their profligacy by vetoes. I couldn't get at it with the line item veto. It was buried. I'll show you how to change the law to give the governor power. No one's ever accused me of not wanting power. Our expenses are under the national average for the last 8 years, under the regional average. Last year, I cut my own agencies 2.6% negative growth. We are way ahead of the national average in conserving, despite the Republican spending.
Thank you, Governor. And now Mr. Renfrey is ready and waiting. It's your turn.
With your permission, I cannot ethically answer the question on gambling because I'm on the board of directors of Poly Manufacturing, which is a gambling company, and I don't think it's proper to express my opinion. So I'd like to go to a different subject. Okay? Number one, as usual, Mario misstates the facts. He's a master at this. This man is the ultimate American master of obfuscation. There are 8 categories for which the death sentence may be opposed in the Volcker bill, and he talks about one category. 8 different categories, and there are 2 sets of trials, and not only are there 2 sets of trials, but I'm going to remind him something he wants to forget. It required the advocacy of the Democratic members of the Assembly to get the bill sent up to them because the Democrats control the Assembly. So a great number of Democrats had to agree with it, and I remind you that it is the people of the state of New York, otherwise the legislature couldn't have passed that bill, and you vetoed it 8 times in a row, okay? I will sign that bill into being the second I'm governor.
Thank you, Mr. Renfrey. And once again, it's time to take a brief suspension in our activity in this broadcast. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. And we continue now with more in our gubernatorial debate. This evening, we turn to Eric Chris from the Syracuse Herald-Journal. This will be the final question of our debate. It goes to Mr. Ween, and because of time limitations, we'll have to limit Mr. Ween's response to 2 minutes. Eric?
Mr. Ween, recently, Mr. Cuomo's Lieutenant Governor Stan Lundin was in town, urging the newspapers to look skeptically upon statements made by Ward Stone, a wildlife pathologist who works for the State Department of Environmental Conservation. He has been critical of a recent mall that's been built here in Syracuse, pointing to samples he's taken showing pollution at that site. There is a rift between Mr. Stone and Mr. Jorling, and Mr. Lundin, when he was here, suggested that he really thinks that Mr. Stone ought to be fired. What do you think of that?
Eric,
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know Mr. Lundin, I don't know Mr. Stone, I don't know what they're talking about, so I don't have any answer for you intelligently. I think, though, as a community activist for 24 years, what we must do is involve the people of the community in the decision-making process, not after the deals have been made, but at the beginning of the process. We have to develop strategies that look to what government wants to do and involve people. And I think that's where people, especially people in the upstate counties, are disgusted with government. They're putting in waste management programs here and facilities there, and they're doing this in this locality, and it comes as a shock to people. You can't do that. Now, since you gave me the opportunity not to answer the question because I don't know what you're talking about, I just want to say that Mr. London was quoted in a Syracuse paper thusly: London, who, unlike Ween, said he prefers a Renfrey victory to a Cuomo re-election. It seems to me that he should be asked, how can he, a man who professes to be the right-to-life candidate, and he's really trying to make a lot out of that, endorse the only pro-abortionist in this race? At least Mr. Cuomo says he's personally opposed, and he has reservations. But Mr. Renfrey is the only one who's pro-abortion. The leadership questions, ladies and gentlemen, is how you stand on your feet and answer the questions directly, and don't talk out of two sides of your mouth, talk directly. Mr. London, how do you, in your wildest imaginations, come to the conclusion that you could support Mr. Renfrey?
Thank you, Mr. Wayne, and now let's quickly move to Governor Cuomo.
45 seconds. I think one of the interesting developments here is that I'm opposed by 3 Republicans, all of whom agree at least on one thing, and that is that the Senate majority, led by Ralph Marino, that has raised taxes a couple of $100 million more than I asked them to, and raised spending about $1 billion more than I asked them to, and then there's an argument about whether I should protect them against their excesses. They all 3 agree that the Senate majority, which has been in power for 50 years, and Mr. Renfrey says that's much too long, 8 years is too much, imagine 50 years in the Senate, that they ought to be removed. I suggest to all of the Democrats and all of the Republicans that you listen to the 3 Republicans when they tell you it's time for a Democratic Senate.
Thank you, Governor, and now to Mr. Renfrey for your
boy, I'll tell you,
statement.
you ought to be in a race car racer, because you go around the track more than any human being I ever met. It is unbelievable to listen to your answers. First of all, the Assembly doesn't count, right? You don't matter with the Assembly, which is totally Democratic and has been all your term. You leave it out, don't you, in your calculations? They've had nothing to do with the bills you could veto, the bill where you could cut spending, where you could impound money. No, the Democrats have nothing to do with it. You are the governor. You have the power to cut spending. You have the power to find where the money's been elevated by the Constitution, but you're never responsible. Have you been responsible for anything that's happened in this state? And since you're governor 8 years, I want to ask a question. How come this state is in such a mess? Because you're governor.
Thank you, Mr. Renfrey, and now the final remarks this evening from Mr. London.
It's very obvious that we have rather 3 interesting statements. Mr. Cuomo I would regard as the grand deceiver. He talks about spending in this state, takes no responsibility for the spending, it's all the Republicans' fault. We have Mr. Renfrey I regard as the tragic distraction, a character out of a Saturday Night Live sitcom. And we have Lou Ween, who is engaged in the grand lie, because in fact I have never endorsed Mr. Renfrey. You must be reading comic books, because that's what I suggest you read. If we are in fact going to talk about real issues, I think it's important to note that there is someone in this campaign who is trying to reach out for working people who want to relieve the enormous tax burden on their shoulders. I am quite obviously that candidate.
Thank you, Mr. London. And as often happens, all too quickly, our time is up. It has been an interesting and informative hour, and for that, we offer our deep thanks to the candidates. We thank our panelists, and we thank all of you for watching. For all of us in Debate 90, I'm Ron Curtis. Good evening.
Good day from the nation's capital.